US airstrikes in western Iraq have killed several militia fighters. 3 locations were hit in Iraq, including Al-Qaim on the border with Syria. The target was a Shia militia group called Kataib Hezbollah, which isn't to be confused with Hezbollah in Lebanon. Iraq's Kataib Hezbollah is part of the Popular Mobilisation Forces, which helped the Iraqi government's fight against ISIL. Now, the US airstrikes also hit 2 targets in Syria, but the Pentagon hasn't said where. Here's some of what the Pentagon has had to say. In response to repeated Kataib Hezbollah attacks on Iraqi bases that host Operation Inherent Resolve coalition forces, US forces have conducted precision defensive strikes against 5 Kataib Hezbollah facilities in Iraq and Syria. And that will degrade KH's ability to conduct future attacks against coalition forces. Let's go live now to Al Jazeera's Simona Faltine in Baghdad. And can you tell us the latest of what you're hearing about these strikes?
Well, the Pentagon has, for the first time, confirmed that it has hit targets of the Popular Mobilisation Forces in Iraq. Now, this is quite a significant development. The Popular Mobilisation Forces have, in the past, accused the U.S. of striking its positions, but this was never confirmed. So this is quite a significant development. And of course, it comes at the back of a series of rocket attacks aimed at bases where both Iraqi and U.S. personnel are based. The latest of these attacks occurred on Friday in Kirkuk, and for the first time, a U.S. contractor was killed and several U.S. personnel were injured in this attack. Now, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo had warned in December that any such attacks that would result in harm of U.S. forces or their allies would be met with decisive force. So these strikes that happened tonight are a response to the attack on Friday, but more broadly, a response to this increase in rocket attacks against bases here in Iraq. Now, it's quite significant because until now, the U.S. has been appealing to the Iraqi government to take its responsibility to protect U.S. forces here on the ground who are here by the invitation of the government seriously. But there seems to be some sort of disillusionment with the government for not doing enough to really protect these bases, but also to not really doing enough to rein in these groups under the Popular Mobilisation Forces, which are officially at least integrated into the armed forces. Of course, there have also been promises of many investigations, but very few of them, actually none of them, have really attributed responsibility. So it seems that the U.S. has decided to take matters into its own hands. This is quite a drastic development because until now, the U.S. has tried to rather keep a low profile because there is a lot of opposition to U.S. military presence here in Iraq, especially by these groups. And let's remember that the PMF has many groups that also hold seats in parliament, and there have been efforts to actually launch bills to try to expel U.S. forces. So it remains to be seen what reaction there will be to this strike by U.S. forces, both in parliament but also on the ground.
Yeah, Simona, I just want to talk a little bit more about these groups. You talk about the Popular Mobilisation Forces being integrated into the Iraqi military, but they're also linked to Iran and Kataib Hezbollah, and how that organisation factors into this as well, because that's been the target of these particular strikes.
Well, the Popular Mobilisation Forces include dozens of different groups, and there have been several efforts by the current administration as well as previous administrations in Iraq to formally integrate them. Now, to what extent that is actually happening on the ground is a big question. There are several groups that are their answer to the Iraqi Prime Minister as the Commander-in-Chief, but then there are some groups which are often referred to as rogue elements who are said to be answering to Tehran rather than to Baghdad. And Kataib Hezbollah is one of these groups, and it is one of the groups that U.S. officials said was responsible for at least one of these attacks that we have seen on U.S. bases. So the big question here is, how will the Iraqi government react? There are U.S. airstrikes happening on its own soil against groups that are supposedly integrated into the armed forces. So we have to wait and see how the government will react to this, whether it will take its own measures to try to stabilize the situation.
Simone, thank you. Simona Faltine live there from Baghdad.